My name is Kyle Jensen, and I'm the Director of Writing Programs at ASU. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first Tomorrow Talks event for the 2024-2025 academic year. The Tomorrow Talks series places the thought leaders of today in conversation with the changemakers of tomorrow, our students. Each distinguished speaker explains how they use writing to address our world's most pressing challenges. This afternoon, we welcome Nathan Thrall, author of The Day in the Life of Abed Salama, Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy. Nathan Thrall received the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction for A Day in the Life of Abed Salama. He is also the author of The Only Language They Understand, Forcing Compromise in Israel and Palestine. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Guardian, the London Review of Books, and the New York Review of Books, and has been translated into more than 24 languages. He spent a decade at the International Crisis Group, where he was director of the Arab-Israeli Project and has taught at Bard College. He lives in Jerusalem. Today, Thrall will be talking with Victor Peskin, an associate professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies and an affiliated faculty member in Jewish Studies at ASU. He is also a senior research fellow at UC Berkeley's Human Rights Center. Peskin's research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of international relations, comparative politics, and human rights. He is the co-author of Hiding in Plain Sight, The Pursuit of War Criminals from Nuremberg to the War on Terror, and the author of International Justice in Rwanda and the Balkans, Virtual Trials and the Struggle for State Cooperation. Later this fall, Peskin will be teaching a political science course on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at ASU. Please join me in welcoming Nathan Thrall and Victor Peskin.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to have the opportunity to be in conversation with Nathan Thrall. And Nathan, I'd like to ask you a seemingly simple, but it's a profound question to begin with. Why are you a writer? And what do you believe about the power of writing to enact change in the world?
Thank you, Victor. It's a pleasure to be with you. Pleasure to be with all of you. I'm a writer because I believe that writing can change minds, and I'm writing about one of the most protracted conflicts in the world, and there is ample reason to be extremely pessimistic about the ability of seeing any change in this place. But I really do believe that writing can make a difference, and that's why I've devoted my life to writing about this place. I've seen how much understanding somebody else's story and actually seeing the world through someone else's eyes can make a tremendous difference. I've seen it with delegations who've come to Israel, Palestine, who've come and just communicated with Palestinians and have witnessed the occupation of the West Bank. These experiences are profound for many of the people who have them, and they come away with a totally altered perspective on this place. And so for me, the process of writing about this place really has changed quite a bit, because my understanding of how to bring about change in this place has changed. And initially, I was doing a very different kind of writing. I was doing analytical writing. I was doing historical writing, and that writing was geared toward policymakers, politicians, other journalists, analysts, but a pretty narrow circle of people who were all having conversations with one another about policy related to Israel-Palestine. And over time, I had so many conversations with people in that world who told me that they were privately convinced of many of the things that I was writing, and felt that they couldn't act on it, that they were going to continue to pursue policies that were totally at odds with the things that I was writing. They would tell me that senior U.S. policymakers would tell me I'm convinced that this is a deeply immoral system that we are supporting and that it will continue to exist for the foreseeable future, thanks in significant part to our support for it. And yet, I am never going to act on that knowledge because I don't feel that I have the space to act on it. The kinds of things that I could do differently, realistically, are tiny. They would be laughable to you, Nathan, and they're not even worth trying. I could risk my career over them. And I had enough of those conversations that I decided that what I really wanted to do was to try and talk to a broader audience that could give those politicians and policymakers the space to act on what they actually privately believe. And so after years of working as an analyst and a journalist who was really writing much more essayistic pieces that were geared at convincing those policymakers, I decided that I was going to try and reach a broader audience. And the way that I thought I could do that was through storytelling, was through narrative. And so I left a job that I'd had for 10 years working for a international NGO, and devoted myself to writing full time and working on this book, which was aimed really at reaching people who might not even have an interest in Israel-Palestine, but would have an interest in a very human story of a father searching for his son, unable to find his son. And through the course of reading that story, that they would learn about Israel-Palestine and that they would learn about the history of the place and the system of control that Palestinians live under. And so for me, the real aim of this book was similar to that of these delegations that bring people to the West Bank. It was to reach people viscerally. It was much less important for me that people came away with a lot of detailed knowledge of, statistics and the methods of control and how the segregated road system works and how the checkpoints work and how the permit system works. That's all there, and a person absorbs it, but it's much less important, I think, than the gut feeling that somebody has of what it actually is to live under this thing. And the fact that we as Americans are supporting it.
Well, with that in mind, I think the next question follows along these lines. You could have told many stories about the situation in the West Bank and the human side, but you tell a particular story. So can you tell us about your decision to focus the book around a tragic bus accident rather than an event or series of events such as an Israeli raid in a West Bank town? Such an example that may have more obviously shined a light on the structural violence of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. So, how come you chose the story of an accident? And at the beginning of the book, you have a very moving epigram about accidents and how accidents are not always accidents. So I'd like to pose that question to you.
Yeah, thank you. It was very important for me that this book, in addition to telling the story of this tragedy, which I found deeply moving, that it was also a history of Israel-Palestine, and that it was also a description of the system of control. And in order for an effective critique to be made of this system of control, I felt that what you really wanted to show was the everyday. You didn't want to show an exception. You didn't want to show an extreme event, something that a reader could dismiss as the decision of one bad commander, the effect of some particular geopolitical circumstance, the behavior of one particular leader. This is a book that is a critique of an entire system. And a systemic critique, I think, is made much more effectively by showing the everyday. So from the outset, I had the notion that I was going to choose something commonplace, something like an accident that happens all over the world, but to show what that means, what a road accident means in Palestine, what it means to have this particular set of victims, a group of Palestinian kindergartners on this particular road behind this wall with Israeli emergency services, not the first Israeli fire trucks not showing up for 30 minutes afterward. I think I should, before I get into too many details, maybe just describe a little bit what the basic outline of the book is for those who don't know. The book tells the story of an accident that took place in Jerusalem in 2012, and it tells the story of a community that is surrounded by walls. This community is in the greater Jerusalem area, is partially annexed by Israel in 1967, partially not annexed, but it's an entire enclave of about 130,000 people today who are living in a walled ghetto. And this Palestinian community, like Palestinians in East Jerusalem in general, face a shortage of classrooms. The parents in this community are forced to choose between a very limited number of educational options in terms of public schools within the area, or sending their kids through a checkpoint to go to schools on the other side of the wall, confronting Israeli soldiers every day. And I tell the story of one particular school that's within this enclave, that's surrounded by the 26-foot tall separation wall on three sides, and by another kind of wall on the fourth side, a wall that runs through a segregated road, Route 4370, often called the Apartheid Road. And the kindergarten class of this school had made a plan to go to a play area, and they chose a rather distant play area because within this community there are no playgrounds, no play areas, there are no sidewalks, and there is hardly any infrastructure. People are, burning their trash in the street in the middle of the night. And just on the other side of the wall, within view of the people in this community, are upper middle class and middle class homes in the East Jerusalem settlement of Pisgat Ze'ev. And the parents in this community who sent their kids to this school sent them off on a rainy morning, one February, with terrible weather. And because the kids in this school couldn't access the play areas just on the other side of the wall, they went a very long distance to the outskirts of Ramallah. And when they passed through a checkpoint, they were struck by a giant semi-trailer. The bus flipped over, it caught fire. 6 children died and 1 teacher. And this was on a road that is under full Israeli control. Israeli police give traffic tickets on this road, but it's a road that's used almost entirely by Palestinians. And who was left to rescue the Palestinians on this burning bus were just people who were on their way to work that morning, who pulled over to the side of the road, got out of their cars, and tried desperately to deal with this crisis of a burning bus. And I tell the story of one particular father of one of the children who was on this bus and how he learns of the accident. He comes to the site of the accident. By the time he gets there, all the children have been removed in private cars. And he asks people in the crowd where the children are, and they tell him different answers, that they're at one Jerusalem hospital, they're at another Jerusalem hospital, they're at the military base a minute up the road, they're at the Ramallah hospital. And the children had indeed been taken off in different directions because the Palestinians in this area live under a permit system, with some who were able to access the superior Jerusalem hospitals and some who were not. And through the story of this father searching for his son, we learn about the entire system of control over Palestinian lives, and we also learn about what it is like for Jews in this area, both settlers and Jews who live within pre-1967 Israel. And the idea of the book was to bring together the perspectives and the lives of these very segregated communities that were all brought into a collision through this tragedy.
I just want to return to writing for a moment before we lose that thread. You had been an analytical writer, and then you shifted to narrative nonfiction. So for the students among us who are, I'm pretty much involved in writing, if you could tell us, had you done narrative nonfiction writing before, that kind of long form process, and what was that like? How did you approach that?
I had done that kind of writing before, but it was really the exception. I had written a kind of a long memoir piece earlier in my career, but almost all my writing on Israel Palestine was analytical, was historical, was essayistic, was often argument driven, and that was really my natural mode of writing, and that kind of writing for me was really driven often by kind of anger. I just a kind of a sense of outrage at how the world is ignoring this injustice, or how it is being mischaracterized by other, prominent writers or analysts. And that has a very, specific quality to it, that kind of writing, and it's a limited range of emotions that come into that kind of writing. And for the most part, my job was to suppress that rage and to make it as cool and analytical as possible. But the process for me, I don't think you could detect so much rage when you read those pieces, but the process for me was one that was driven by that emotion. Whereas in this book, it was something that was much more comprehensive, that drew on a much wider range of emotions, including grief, which is such a huge part of this book. And for that reason, it was a lot more emotionally fraught to write it, but it was also much more fulfilling.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Nathan, for that insight. I want to jump to a bigger picture issue about the conflict generally. With Israeli settlements increasing and the prospects of a lasting Israeli-Palestinian peace accord seemingly elusive, if not impossible at this moment, what, in your view, are the prospects that the dynamics of Israeli control over Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank might change for the better, and not just through these temporary easing measures that you talk about in the book? And can this change in the improvement of governance and quality of life, significant change, can that happen for Palestinians absent a comprehensive peace agreement?
The reality on the ground is only getting worse. It's getting steadily worse, and I do not see any prospect of positive change in the near or medium term. And if we just look at what has been happening since the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza began in 1967, we see a steady process of Israeli Jewish expansion and absorption of large parts of the West Bank, and a constriction of Palestinians into tighter and tighter enclaves. And that process is not only not stopping, it's not slowing, it's accelerating. And we have seen just, in the last 10 months, greater Israeli land acquisition than we had seen in the preceding 10 years combined. So if we just, play this out going forward on its current path, this conflict is only worsening, and you can imagine a situation where it becomes even more hopeless, where you could have another major war with major expulsion of Palestinians. We saw it in 1948. We saw it in 1967. Hundreds of thousands who were forced to flee and who were not permitted to return in both of those wars. And that's something that also can recur. So as bad as it is, it can also get a lot worse. And the only kind of hopeful thing I could say is that there is also a change in global public opinion that we see today. And we see steps toward accountability that we hadn't seen before. Now, they're baby steps. They're just the very beginning of something. But it is the kind of thing that, if amplified, could change things in Israel-Palestine.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to now turn to an important, if secondary, part of your book, because you provide context and history, and one a theme that runs through it is the role of the Palestinian Authority that kind of came into the West Bank following the Oslo Accords, right, and are in control, a part of the West Bank, but you let the reader know it's a problematic governance. So can you discuss what you refer to as the impossible bind facing the Palestinian Authority's security forces in regard to their security cooperation with Israel? And can you also point to examples where Palestinian-Israeli cooperation might improve the lives of Palestinians, but on the other hand, where such cooperation might instead kind of resemble a form of collusion that serves to undermine Palestinian communities? So it's a two-part question there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the characters in the book is a cousin of Abed Salama's, who works in the Palestinian Authority and had worked in the intelligence services, and then worked in the security forces more broadly. And one of the terrible aspects of life for Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank is the pervasiveness of Israeli control, which is unavoidable. There is no way to kind of live a pure life without engagement with Israel. You are forced to deal with Israel in all kinds of ways in your daily life. And the thing that makes it so difficult is it's filled with ambiguity, and it's filled with ambiguity by design. There are very black and white cases of collaboration where somebody needs medical treatment for their mother that they can only get at a superior hospital in Israel. And the Israelis say, if you want a permit to go and exit and bring your mother to this hospital, that can be arranged, but we need some information.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a clear, black and white case. But in your daily life, there are all kinds of gray cases where even just, I have a very close friend and former colleague who, when he had to leave Gaza, he would go for an exit interview. And, you can't escape it. You're not allowed to leave without going through this exit interview with an unnamed, security official or somebody using a pseudonym. And they begin with very innocent questions, how are things? What's the mood? How's the economy? Are the supermarkets, stocked?
Mm-hmm.
What's the price of Coca-Cola? And then they become more political, more detailed. And the whole idea of this is that you never know when you've crossed the line. but you come out of this conversation feeling dirty. You feel like you've collaborated, even if you haven't collaborated. And the bind for the Palestinian Authority security forces is that, they're doing a very good job at providing security for Israel. That's their mission, is to actually stop any attempts to resist their occupiers. And the more effective that they are, the cheaper and easier and therefore more long-lasting this occupation is. Now, there was a kind of umbrella over these security forces in their initial years where there was some kind of hope that they were the kernel of a future Palestinian state, and that you could justify this activity. We need to crush any Palestinian opposition to Israel, including peaceful opposition. They're not just crushing violent opposition to Israel, because that's the calm we need. We need to prove our bona fides, and then we're going to be given a state. And that kind of rhetoric is something that nobody believes in anymore. And so it's clear to most Palestinians that the Palestinian Authority is a key pillar of maintaining an occupation without end. At the same time, it's an enormously complicated subject, because throughout history, whenever you have an enormously powerful force with its boot on the neck of some much weaker force, the argument for collaborating, cooperating, compromising with the boot is the argument of reason and pragmatism. You always have reason on your side there. To try and resist when there's such a power disparity, when it's clearly hopeless, is a very romantic idea. And so the people who are arguing for continuing to collaborate, even when there is no hope of a Palestinian state, even when Israel is saying explicitly, we are opposed to a Palestinian state. The Knesset just voted in large numbers. We are against Palestinian statehood. But even in that scenario, there is an argument for continuing it, and it is a rational argument. And I've had these conversations with senior Palestinian Authority security figures, or even non-security figures, and they would say to me, look, this conflict's not going to be resolved in my lifetime. And what I can do as a Palestinian patriot is to keep the people on their land. Israel wants us out of here. It wants us gone. So what I can do in a situation where I have no power to end this occupation, no power to achieve freedom and independence for my people, is to at least ensure that they're not all leaving. And therefore, when I meet with Israelis, I want to give them the security that they're asking for, and I want to ask for one thing and demand: work permits. I want work permits, because our Palestinian economy, it just sinks or rises depending on a number that they decide, that the Israeli government decides every month. How many work permits are they going to give us? And if they give us more work permits, that means my economy is better, and that means my people are less likely to move abroad, and they're going to stay on their land. And then I hope that we will, stay here to see some other set of circumstances that would arise that would enable us to have freedom and liberty. But those circumstances aren't here today. So it's a very rational argument. And I think that's part of what's so difficult about this subject of collaboration. And there are many instances of it in the book. There are instances where, this cousin of Abed's worked with Israeli generals and he helped to achieve calm for them in a specific area where, the Israeli soldiers were getting rocks thrown at their jeeps, and they would get out and then they would fire at the kids. And they, again, what they want is a smooth occupation without any quote unquote friction, which means without any resistance. And so, if their soldiers are getting out and firing at the kids who are throwing rocks, one day they're going to kill one of the kids and not just shoot him in the leg. And then there's going to be a big funeral, and then there's going to be a bigger protest, and things will escalate. So the Israeli generals were very happy to have a Palestinian figure come in and talk quietly to these kids and ensure that that the rocks would stop. And then in exchange for the rock stopping, this cousin of Abed's achieved some openings in, Israel controls all the roads, all the villages have, only a couple of exits, and it makes, travel times so much longer for Palestinians. It makes life so much more difficult. There are relatives who have much more difficulty seeing one another, all because of Israeli closures that exist throughout the West Bank. And so if you open those up, you've improved the quality of life of a lot of people. And those are the kinds of quid pro quo exchanges. And again, you can rationalize them by saying, those kids who are throwing the rocks, they weren't going to liberate us. That this is a hopeless situation. We're not going to be liberated for decades. So I might as well be able to get to work in 20 minutes instead of 2 hours.
Right. And in your previous book, you talk about the Oslo trap, which I think is related to this, and that's in regard to how the Oslo Peace Accords, signed almost 31 years ago, right, if I have that right, had this promise, unstated promise of a Palestinian state, but because it got stuck in disagreement, quasi-state, or even less, right, because of all the dependence and the road closures and so forth. So the situation might improve somewhat or not, but essentially that phrase, the Oslo trap, seems to speak to how the situation is stuck in this certain gear and it's not about to change, if anything, getting worse. But I want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for drawing that connection. Yeah, I mean, the Oslo trap is creating a system of dependency. So you have created this Palestinian Authority, and you have created a huge number of Palestinians who are dependent on the Palestinian Authority for their survival, for their livelihoods, extended families that have many members who work in the Palestinian Authority. If that Palestinian Authority were to collapse, it would, look like, potentially you could have the West Bank look like Gaza looks. And so the trap is that the Palestinian Authority is this thing that every Palestinian extended family is in one way or another dependent on now, and yet it's also a key pillar of maintaining the occupation indefinitely, and it helps to ease the occupation for Israel. It's in effect an outsourcing of the responsibilities that Israel has as the occupying power to somebody else. When Israel went for Oslo, it was at the end of the first Intifada. It was a massive uprising, and the Israeli leaders at that time, including the defense minister during the first Intifada, Yitzhak Rabin, said, that his entire thinking about how to deal with the Palestinian problem was changed by this mass uprising, and the idea of trying to have Palestinians have some form of limited autonomy to ease the occupation for Israel came directly out of that. And it wasn't just Rabin, it was other leaders. Shamir also was putting forward his own kinds of plans that also would outsource and lighten the occupation for Israel. And now here we are, decades later, decades after Oslo was supposed to be a 5-year process, and it's still the thing that is governing Palestinian life in the West Bank.
Nathan, thanks so much for that really in-depth and very clear understanding of where we are. I want to ask, it might be my last question before we turn to our students, but I want to ask on a somewhat more optimistic note, if I can say, empathy. While your book is about tragedy, it's also about empathy, including the empathy of some Israelis, including emergency responders who you profile. And I was moved by the perspective of one Israeli who you write the following about, quote, "It was natural, he thought, that the death of Jews had more of an effect on him than the death of Palestinians. Any Jew claiming otherwise had to be lying. It just wasn't the same." Still quoting here. "But even remote tragedy took its toll. The children on the bus were part of what Dubé called a distant circle of connection. Yet those backpacks," referring to the children's backpacks, "had brought them closer. He can imagine himself in the place of the parents from Anata and Shuafat camp. Any parent would be torn in two." And with this passage from your book, can you discuss the role that empathy plays in your book?
Thank you. It's everywhere in the book, the theme of empathy or the lack of empathy, because that's also a big part of the book. The book ends with a description of how young Israelis were celebrating the deaths of these innocent kindergartners, and a whole Israeli TV special that was made about the fact that Israelis were celebrating the deaths of these kindergartners and did not have empathy at all for Palestinians. But empathy is really, a theme that exists throughout the book. It exists with Abed arriving at the scene of the crash and seeing two strangers who were headed in the opposite direction, who lived hours away, who without hesitation took him in their car and drove him to the hospital. And we see it also in some of the Israeli emergency service responders who shed tears for these Palestinian children, some of whom they saw. And I think that, the whole book is really, it is about empathy and about also the lack of empathy.
Thank you, Nathan. I really appreciate that. I want to now, let's just see. I have a time for one more question. I want to return to writing, since this is such a key theme of our conversation today. What did you find to be your biggest or most daunting challenge in researching and writing the book, and how did you address it?
For me, the process of writing is really, it's a lot of preparation before I actually begin writing. My wife likes to tease me that this is actually a period of procrastination. But what I think that I'm doing is, I think that I'm really figuring out the structure in detail of what I'm going to write for a long time, and really getting that right before I start. And then when I actually began writing, it was very fast. But for me, the biggest challenge with this book was a structural one, and that's part of why it took so long before I began writing. And the structural problem had to do with the ambitions of the book. The book had the ambition of being an immersive narrative that felt like a nonfiction novel, that was really first and foremost telling the individual human stories of these parents and children and others who interacted with this accident, and telling the story of the accident, and that's the narrative spine of the book.
Mm-hmm.
But I also had other ambitions for the book. I also wanted the book to tell the story of Israel-Palestine. I also wanted it to explain the system of control that is so complicated, and to do it simply. And the simple way to do that is to tell how individual people have to navigate it. Some of them navigating it on the worst day of their life, just trying to find where a son might be located and how to get past segregated roads and checkpoints and walls, and a permit system in order to find the location of of your son. And so because you can only really have so many characters in a book without confusing a reader, and because you can't really bring in a character, you can only do it with a very central character to bring that character in at page 10 and then again at page 100. You really need to choose the moment at which a given person is most important to the story of the crash. But at the same time, that person is also important for their personal story or their family history. There's one doctor, a mother and doctor who's helping rescue children from this burning bus. And she really represents the story of Palestinian exile. And her family was forced to flee Haifa in 1948. And she grew up in a refugee camp in Syria and was eventually able to come back, to come to somewhere in Palestine, not to come to Haifa. And, you also want that backstory and the order in which that backstory is told to make sense. And you don't want to tell about the departure from Haifa in 1948 after you've told about 1967. So balancing those two things was really the greatest challenge in writing this book.
Okay, thanks so much for that insight. And in my view, you pulled it off incredibly well. It's so clear. It's such a complicated story geographically, politically, and historically, but it's so well done and so clearly written. I would like to now, sure, thank you. I'd like to now turn to two of our students, and we are delighted to have them participate. First, I'd like to introduce Sophia Saeed, one of my students. And so Sophia, feel free to unmute and introduce yourself, and then you can ask Nathan your question. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Nathan, for speaking with us today. My name is Sophia. I'm a senior here at ASU. I am studying political science and international studies. I'm currently doing my thesis under Dr. Peskin on the Israel-Palestine conflict. So that's a little bit of my background. So my question to Nathan, the impact of the occupation on children is a central theme in your book. You illustrate how Palestinian children grow up in an environment where safety is never guaranteed, facing constant threat of unjust arrests, a shortage of safe and adequate schools, and oppressive conditions like permits and apartheid roads, culminating in the tragedy such as the bus crash. So over the past several months, we have seen the full extent which the occupation endangers the lives of Palestinians, with children being its most vulnerable group. Can you talk about how recent events shifted or expanded on this theme?
With pleasure. Thank you for that very good question. So obviously, the children have been at the center of the suffering that we have seen in Gaza over the past 11 months. I don't know what the latest figure is, but several months ago already, it was more than 12,000 children who had been killed in Gaza, which was more than the number of children killed in war in the preceding 4 years in the entire world. And now we're seeing a lot of death in the West Bank. The situation there is uh, deteriorating rapidly. We have over 600 Palestinians who've been killed on the West Bank since October 7th. And of course, a large number of these are also minors. And so, I think that um, focusing on children in the book is one of the things that actually, makes it, in one sense, easier for people to empathize with this story. People who might be more resistant to empathize with it, but it's also reflective of the reality of this place that children are disproportionately affected by the violence here.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Thank you both. And now I'd like to turn to another student, Erin Slutsky. So Erin, welcome, and feel free to introduce yourself as well.
Hi there. Thank you so much for talking with us today. I've really enjoyed reading your book.
Thank you.
So my question, or I guess I'll tell you, I'm a communications major with a minor in writing, rhetoric, and rural, and I am a senior, so I'm looking at grad school soon. So my question real quick is, how has your story of Abed Salama traveled and transformed throughout the current social, political, and economic climate of the continuing Israeli and Palestinian conflict?
Well, it's been very prescient in many ways. I wish it weren't, but the very fact that the book, describes dehumanization, that is so much at the heart of what allows the kind of violence that we've seen over the last year, that it describes how, ordinary people could celebrate the deaths of kindergartners on a school bus. I think that's something that we've seen normalized, that we've seen become much more mainstream over the last year. We have an Israeli center-left president who said something to the effect of, there are no innocents in Gaza. And I my aim really in telling this particular story was to draw our attention to the everyday tragedy of Israel-Palestine and the periods that aren't characterized by tremendous violence like we've seen in the last year. Because at the time that I was writing, I had a kind of despair over the fact that the Palestinian issue was sinking in global public attention. The world was growing more and more indifferent to a deeply unjust situation. And they would pay attention when there's violence like there is now. They would pay attention when there were wars in Gaza or some spike in violence elsewhere. And what they would say at that time is, we need to restore calm. And then they would go about, once the violence was over, they'd go about basically ignoring the situation or supporting it or tacitly accepting it, depending on the particular case. And what I really wanted to do was to draw our attention to the situation as it exists when there isn't tremendous violence, and to remind us how much tragedy there is in that situation, and how much we need to acknowledge our own complicity and to do something to change it. And so even today, I mean, sadly, with all of the violence that we see in Gaza and the West Bank, even today, there is diminishing attention to this issue. You see it's sinking in how much coverage it's getting, where it's getting covered, whether it's on the front page anymore, how often. And so for me, despite all of this interest that there is now over the last year in Palestine, I still think that this task of drawing our attention to the system itself and not just the wars is essential and will remain essential when this war in Gaza finally comes to an end.
Thank you so much for that answer. I actually had a quick follow-up.
Sure, absolutely. That there is time, so feel free.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, so I know from social media and like the news, I think like you said, the attention there's a spotlight on Israel and Palestine because of the violence. And it's also caused there to be other spotlights around the world with the Congo and different instances of injustice like that. So as the conflict begins to shed light on other struggles against occupation around the world, do you feel that your book applies to a broader context?
I think it applies insofar as, I'm talking about universal human themes. I'm talking about oppression. I'm talking about betrayal. I'm talking about love and jealousy and, parenthood. So I think it applies in those very human ways, but also, of course, in many ways, the story of Israel-Palestine is very specific to Israel-Palestine.
Thank you so much for the answer. Thanks for being here today.
No, thank you.
Thank you both. We have at least one audience question. So this is from someone named Mariam, and it's a short question. I'm working on a book on the same subject. What tips can you give me for it? So it's an open-ended one.
Yeah. I assume that by the same subject, Mariam means Israel-Palestine, and not that she's writing about the same bus accident. It's hard to give tips about just to somebody who's writing about Israel-Palestine in general, other than to say that I think that one of the most important things is to write about the place as cleanly and clearly as you possibly can, with as little jargon as possible. And I think that it's a lot more powerful if with very simple language you can describe something that might typically have a big, long, fancy word attached to it. Because ultimately what you're trying to do is persuade people. And a lot of those words are signals that you're inside, that you're an insider in some group, and that we all use this word in this group. But actually you're trying to reach people who aren't part of that group. And you shouldn't be concerned about signaling to anybody that you're in any group. You really want to convey the human reality of what it is that you're describing, and to do it in a way that would make an ordinary person who knows nothing about Israel-Palestine feel something and change their perspective on it. So I think the advice that I would give is really to try and, as much as possible, to describe things in a very cool way that is much more like descriptive writing than like something that might be submitted to a journal.
Thank you, Nathan. We have time for one last question, so I'm going to sneak one in there and then wrap up. For students, faculty members, staff, others in the ASU community, and more generally who might be here with us today or listen to the recording, what suggestions do you have for further learning, be it in the realm of narrative nonfiction or other suggestions, either for readings or ways to kind of think more deeply about the conflict?
So, I think that, first of all, I would recommend a documentary film that is called The Law in These Parts. And I think it's the best film ever done on the occupation. It's deceptively simple, but it shows how it was built layer by layer. It shows all the justifications for it. And it does so with interviews with a lot of judges who were judges in the Israeli military court system, and some of the architects of that system, many of whom consider themselves liberals. And I think it's just an extraordinarily powerful film that I highly recommend. One of the best diplomatic histories that in fact the best diplomatic history of Israel-Palestine, in my view, is a book by Avi Schleim called The Iron Wall. And this is a history of the entire conflict that is just extraordinarily well done. A Palestinian history by a superb diplomatic historian is The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. And for more narrative books, I would recommend really almost anything by the Palestinian writer Raja Shahada, who writes a lot of books with his own personal experiences, some family memoirs. There's a book called Strangers in the House that he wrote that is exceptional, but really almost anything by Raja Shahada is a great thing to read.
Nathan, thank you so much. These are very valuable. I'm taking detailed notes because I'll be teaching a course on the conflict later this semester. So I also really appreciate that. It's been an honor to speak with you. I hope next time in Jerusalem in person. I'd like to thank Kyle Jensen for the invitation, and a thank you to Dean Jeffrey Cohen and English Chair Noosh Powell for their support, and to Kristen LaRue and Bruce Matusenaga for all their help and work behind the scenes to organize the event. Additional thanks to Byron Echeverria from Macmillan Publishers. And finally, we want to thank our incredible ASU writing teachers who work tirelessly to help ASU students imagine a brighter future. Thank you, everyone. It's been a great turnout. Thank you so much, Nathan Thrall.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely.